Welcome to London History at Home, our historic London jokes edition. My name's Rebecca.
I'm Gordon.
We were both tour guides in London in person, in real life, for about 15 years or so each. And we're now virtual tour guides, which we've been doing for about a year, so we're still feeling our way. This edition, we thought, January's kind of a depressing month. Christmas is over, it's dark and wintry. So we thought we'd talk about jokes throughout London history, jokes and comedians and comic plays and all that sort of how London has had fun through the centuries. Rude joke alert. If you're watching this with your children, there are going to be rude jokes. We're going to be telling some sort of genuinely historic jokes. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't know really, the jokes that tend to have survived through history do tend to be the rude ones. So there are going to be rude jokes with adult content and grown-up words. Yes. So yeah, if you're easily offended, just don't watch this one. Go and watch the one we did about animals or something instead. But with no further ado, let's go and find out what the medieval Londoner was laughing at. Before we get going properly, we've got our first slide here showing that if you'd like the video, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you can find it in your heart, please donate to the Multiple Sclerosis Society, either via the donate page at londonhistoryathome.com or in whatever way you see fit. And again, rude jokes, please. If the kids are watching, put on your headphones. And we're starting out with the earliest known joke in London. The earliest recorded joke in London is from the 1st century. This is a depiction of Roman London from the Museum of London. This joke was discovered in the 2010s when they were building the Bloomberg building on Queen Victoria Street, along with loads of other Roman artifacts. So this is the London Mithraeum now. You can go and visit it. That's some of the artifacts from the last time I visited the Mithraeum a few years ago. They found this temple of Mithras. It's a Persian deity that the Romans nicked. And this writing tablet, which is the first mention of London, of the word London from the 1st century. But as well as all that very exciting archaeological stuff, they found this stylus. So this is a writing stylus. It was used for writing on wax tablets. You can see it's got a Latin inscription on it. The first line of it is ab urbe veni munus tibi gratum ad fero. I'm not doing the whole thing. But basically it's, I went to Rome and all I got you was this lousy pen. So not a hilarious joke, but kind of a dry witticism that we still see around today. Not in the Latin version though. The oldest surviving joke in English dates from the 10th century from a book called the Exeter Riddles. It's called the Exeter Riddles, but there would have been similar books written by monks all over the country, including in London. It's just that none of the London ones survived. So riddles, very Anglo-Saxon, early medieval. It was a very popular thing to do, to have these riddles, which were written up by monks and nuns. Bear that in mind when we talk about the content of some of them. And it was a very Anglo-Saxon medieval thing to do, sit around the fire, you read out the riddles and you try and figure out what the answer is. Several of the Exeter riddles, and probably the others as well, are rather rude double entendres written down by this cheeky chappy here. So one of them, there's one of our monks. I heard that something was growing in the corner, swelling and sticking up, raising its roof. A proud bride grasped that boneless thing with her hands, a lord's daughter covered with a garment, that bulging thing. The answer is, of course, bread dough. Get your minds out of the gutter. There's another of the longer riddles, which I've paraphrased slightly. What stands in a bed is hairy beneath, is handled by women and makes their eyes water. The answer is, of course, an onion. I don't know what you lot were thinking. There's a few others that are very rude. And some of the Exeter riddles and other Anglo-Saxon riddles are, of course, meant to be thought-provoking and they're clean. But I do sometimes wonder, so much of comedy relies on context and current events. I wonder if some of those riddles that seem to us quite clean and innocent are in fact hilarious and really rude if read 1,000 years ago.
At the royal court, jesters or fools were a court fixture, although they went by various names throughout history. William the Conqueror's jester came over with him during the Norman conquest. He was called Taillefer and joined the charge against the English lines at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, while singing and juggling with his sword. One of the Conqueror's sons became Henry I in 1100. An entertainer in his court was named Rahere. It's not known what his comedy act was, but he founded St. Bartholomew's Hospital after falling ill on a pilgrimage and promising God he'd build a hospital for the poor if he made it back to London. Rahere started a long tradition of comedians supporting charitable causes. Later in the 12th century, Roland the Farter was the height of royal comedy. He was given a manor in Suffolk and tracts of land in return for performing his stunt at Christmas every year for King Henry II, the grandson of King Henry I. His name might have clued you in, but his signature joke, which was recorded in the Royal Archives, was a jump, a whistle, and a fart. It wouldn't be at all funny to go through every monarch's court jester, so we won't. But it wasn't just the kings, queens, and courtiers who were enjoying comedic performances. There were medieval groups of actors, sometimes paid by monasteries and churches, who were supposed to perform dramatizations of biblical stories or morality plays at Christian festivals, but probably didn't take much time for the actors to realize that if they threw in a few funny moments, it went down a lot better with their audiences. Certainly by the 14th century, mystery plays were doing the rounds, which, while based on a biblical event, would usually contain comedy and clowning. In London, medieval plays were performed at the Holy Priory Church next to St. Catherine's Cree on Leadenhall Street.
Yes. So it wasn't only mystery plays. Mystery plays would generally have gone on usually at Christian festivals, but there were a lot of them with Saints' Days. There were also travelling minstrels and mimes and jugglers and entertainers who would have set up inns and taverns around London to entertain the locals. And at certain times of year, there also would have been fairs around London and around the country, of course. But in London, we had, well, St. Bartholomew's Fair. Was held every August at Smithfield, just outside the city of London. A first one recorded in 1133, and they went on into the 19th, every year into the 19th century. So it was it was a cloth fair, in theory, but really it was puppet shows and musicians and magicians and performers and plays and all sorts of things, and stalls and drinking and fun. And in the early 16th century, there was a chap called Andrew Board, and B-O-R-D. He went on to be a doctor, actually. It's said that he was the original Merry Andrew. A Merry Andrew is the name for a clown who is particularly buffoonish, act in a particularly buffoonish way, is known as a Merry Andrew, or was known as a Merry Andrew. Board is also created with creating the first guidebook, which is written in rhyme, with some of it being funny and some of it obviously meant to be funny. We just don't get it. All these years later. He apparently wrote the guidebook, went into this comedy guidebook business after giving up being a monk, because he didn't like being a monk because he couldn't eat meat or converse with women, to use the 16th century euphemism. When he was a monk, he called himself Andreas Parforatus, which is Latin for Bored Andrew.
The May Fair was held near what is now Park Lane from the 13th century to the 19th. Entertainments included semolina eating contests, puppet shows, temporary theatres, and women's foot races, which I'm afraid was considered comedy by the less enlightened men watching. In the 18th century, a gingerbread seller called Tiddy Doll was a regular at the May Fair. Tiddy Doll sang comedy or nonsense songs to attract customers. In one of the songs, he says he lives with a wisecum, a riscum, and a why not, and says his gingerbread will melt in your mouth like a red-hot brickbat and rumble in your stomach like Punch in his wheelbarrow, which doesn't sound particularly appetizing.
The Southwark Fair, and this is the Southwark Fair, was held in September since probably the 15th century, and again into the 19th century. It was depicted in this print by Hogarth, who also painted Tiddy Doll, the gingerbread seller who Gordon was talking about. In this print, Hogarth is lampooning the festivals that took place around public hangings. Hogarth is often considered the grandfather of political satire. So yeah, most of London's annual fairs, which looked like they were awfully good fun, most of them were banned in the 19th century because people had a bit too much fun and they were considered rowdy, and posh people didn't want any of that.
We heard earlier about the 10th century riddle book with the rude jokes in it, but the first proper joke book in English appeared in the Tudor period, published by a bookseller called Winkin de Word, who was working on Fleet Street. He was actually the first to have a printing press on Fleet Street, which would become renowned for its newspaper industry over the next 500 years. De Word published Demand Joyeux in 1511, with the first recorded jokes in a style we would recognize today with a question and answer. Some of the jokes are still funny, usually the rude ones. Here's a few we liked. What is the distance from the highest point of the sea to the deepest? A stone's throw.
Why do men make an oven in the town? Because they can't make a town in the oven.
What is the cleanest leaf among all the leaves? Holly leaves, because nobody will wipe their arse with them.
Who let loose the first fart? Some arsehole.
What time of year does a goose bear the most feathers? When the gander is on her back.
Which animal has her tail between her eyes? A cat when she licks her arse.
Oh dear.
Some good old Tudor jokes there.
Yes.
It's often said that the first comedy play in English, anyway, was a play called Ralph Roister Doister, which was written for the boys of Westminster School by one of the masters there, Nicholas Udall, in 1553, and presumably first performed at Westminster School. However, there is a 14th century play that survives. It was written in English. It was actually written in the Midlands rather than London. It's called The Interlude of the Student and the Girl, and it was performed by those travelling medieval players we were talking about earlier, and it has comedy and farce, and it's funny. Some historians have suggested that many, if not all, medieval acting groups, including those in London, would have performed comedy plays, usually in English, because they would have wanted their audience to understand them. Wouldn't have been any good doing it in Latin or French. But few of these probably poorer medieval acting groups, few of them would have had the necessary skills to write them down, and even fewer would have had the money or the links to get them published. So the one that survives is the Nicholas Udall one from 1553, but it's thought that there were loads of medieval comedies, it's just that we don't know any of them. None of them have survived.
As we've discovered, there's no doubt that Londoners were already familiar with comedy performances in plays. But the man credited with revolutionizing English comedy theatre is Shakespeare. So let's talk about him for a bit, the immortal bard. There's a speech in Macbeth, I mean the Scottish play, that features the phrase, knock, knock, who's there, several times. It's spoken by the porter in Act 2, Scene 3. When Macduff is knocking on the door and the porter is complaining in a funny way about the effect of the knocking on his hangover. Some point to it as the first knock-knock joke, but it doesn't really follow the formula. The first proper knock-knock jokes appeared in vaudeville, music halls, and children's games in the early 20th century, a good 300 years after Macbeth premiered in 1606. Most of Shakespeare's plays had a bit of comedy in because he was trying to make a living, and he knew if he didn't have something entertaining, then his audience would leave and go to another theatre. There was plenty of competition in Bankside in the 16th and 17th century. Those jokes are still in the plays, but the ones we get without a long explanation are usually the rude ones. There are plenty of Shakespeare jokes, which I'm sure you can Google, but we've got a few of our favourites. In Titus Andronicus, Shakespeare tells an early your mother joke. Chiron says, "Thou hast undone our mother," in which Aaron replies, "Villain, I have done thy mother." In Othello, there's a bit of a fart joke in dialogue between the clown and the musician. Clown, "Are these, I pray you, wind instruments?" Musician, "Aye, marry, they are, sir." "Oh, thereby hangs a tale." "Whereby hangs a tale, sir?" "Marry, sir, by many a wind instrument that I know." In Twelfth Night, Malvolio spells out the C word in a speech about a letter from his wife. It's perhaps worth mentioning that nothing was Elizabethan slang for a lady's part, which brings a whole new meaning to the title, Much Ado About Nothing.
So comedy plays continue to be a thing in London theatre. The first stand-up is a little bit more of a tricky thing to pin down. So I've read that the person who's considered the first stand-up comedian is Samuel Foote in the 18th century, in the 1700s. So Samuel Foote ended up becoming an actor to get himself out of debtor's prison, basically. So he became an actor because he was poor, and he quickly became known for comedy and mimicry. In 1747, he put on a one-man show called Diversions of the Morning or a Dish of Chocolate. It was a satire, it was basically a one-man show, a satire on contemporary public figures and other actors, and it's considered to be it's considered by some to be the first stand-up show, because it does sound a lot like something that, you know, Rory Bremner would do, a stand-up lampooning other people around at the time. He continued his comedy routine. That show was closed down after about 2 performances, I think. But he continued to get in trouble for lampooning other actors and public figures. And a lot of his comedy, after a riding accident in 1766, when his leg was amputated, relied on a joke with his last name Foote and the fact that he only had one foot. So he sounds very much like an 18th century Adam Hills. So apparently he's done the first stand-up show in London in 1747. I think it does depend on how you define a stand-up show, though. I mean, those performers at medieval fairs would have been standing on their own telling jokes. But we don't know the names of any of them. So probably one of them, unnamed performers, was the first stand-up comedian in London. I do want to mention 2 others that I've come across in my revels through history books. In 1611, a former pickpocket called Mary Frith, also known as Moll Cutpurse, performed at the Fortune Theatre in the City of London, which no longer survives. She bantered with the audience, she told bawdy jokes, she played songs, sang songs playing a lute, which sounds a lot like a comedy gig to me, kind of a Bill Bailey-esque comedy gig. Mary Frith was very controversial in her day. So she was a woman, but she wore men's clothes and she drank and she smoked, considered very controversial in her day. She was buried at St. Bride's Church just off Fleet Street, and it's said that she was buried upside down. She requested to be buried upside down so she could be as preposterous in death as she had been in life. There's one more that I just want to suggest for the first stand-up comedian in London, which is this chap, Richard Tarleton. So Richard Tarleton was gigging, kind of just crossing over with Shakespeare. So he was just before Shakespeare, and actually apparently did act in some of Shakespeare's early shows. So Tarleton was known for his comic doggerel verse. So he did everything in verse, but he would improvise it. So he would improvise it. He'd ask the audience for suggestions for verse. If somebody heckled him, he'd heckle back in verse, which sounds really like an improv show, a modern improv show, but you know, Elizabethan. So yeah, I think stand-up comedian is a tricky one to pin down, and I think I'm voting for Moll Frith just because she's so funny.
A phenomena that had a huge influence on British comedy was music hall. The first purpose-built music hall was the Canterbury Hall on Westminster Bridge Road in Lambeth. It was opened on the 17th of May, 1852. Before then, entertainments had been put on in the back rooms of pubs or at song and supper rooms, such as Evans Music and Supper Rooms in Covent Garden, Dr. Johnson's concert rooms on Fleet Street, or the Song and Supper Club at the Coal Hole pub on the Strand. The first performers at the Canterbury could be described as the first music hall artists, but they remain unrecorded because Morton and Stanley mostly used unpaid amateurs in the early days. The music hall was badly damaged during an air raid in 1942 and was never rebuilt. There are innumerable music hall acts, even if you narrow it down to those who found fame in London. So we'll just talk about a few of them briefly. One of the earlier entertainers at the Canterbury Music Hall in the 1850s was London-born Louisa Caulfield and her husband John. Louisa Caulfield had also performed in the Song and Supper Rooms and was known for rewriting popular comic songs from a female perspective. Sam Cowell is often credited as the creator of the music hall genre. He was born in London in 1820, but was raised in the USA. He came back to London in his 20s and started performing in the Song and Supper Rooms and then in the early music halls. He certainly became very popular, even performing before Queen Victoria.
Was the Queen amused?
I bet she was not, especially if we performed before her. And they said, well, I didn't know you were going first.
Oh, dear.
Sorry, that was a bad joke. My more well-known music hall star was Marie Lloyd, who specialised in double entendre and innuendo, particularly with her most famous song, She Sits Among the Cabbages and Peas, which, when prudish Victorians complained that it was too rude, Lloyd changed to She Sits Among the Cabbages and Leeks. Another London-born music hall star, Dan Leno, joined his parents' music hall act in 1864 at the age of 4 years old. Leno became known for comedy songs and a kind of observational comedy, creating characters based on people Londoners met every day, such as railway guards, beefeaters, firemen, grocers, and hairdressers. The legacy of Music Hall has left us with many of the revered old jokes.
My dog's got no nose.
How does he spell?
Terrible.
She was only a photographer's daughter, but she was very well developed. My wife's gone to Indonesia.
Jakarta.
No, she went by boat. She also went to the West Indies.
Jamaica.
No, she wanted to go.
Doctor, doctor, I feel like a pair of curtains.
Oh, pull yourself together.
Conductor, is this bus going to Clapham?
Only if you're very good.
Does this bus stop at the embankment?
If not, there'll be a very loud splash. Londoners have a history of one-off comedy stunts and pranks. Here's a few of our favourites. In 1818, Usher the Clown made his way to the Old Vic Theatre via the Thames. His chosen craft was a washing tub pulled by geese. With the tide, so the geese probably didn't have much to do with the propulsion. The following year, he made his way to the theatre in a cat-drawn cart from Waterloo Bridge. Luckily, it's downhill to the Old Vic. From there, so again, the cats probably didn't need to do much pulling. Both of these stunts were publicity for the annual benefit show at the Old Vic, which raised money for charity. A lovely random fact about Richard Usher is that he lived in the same building in Lambeth, Hercules Building, as William Blake, who was not exactly a comedian, but his art and poetry is a little surreal. In the 1930s, the elite of London society received invitations for a very fancy garden party at 23 to 24 Leinster Gardens, which would be fine, except those buildings are false frontages, which were built in the 1860s to provide a steam outlet for the new underground lines beneath. The posh ladies and gents did apparently turn up at the party in the 1930s and were somewhat miffed. The fake frontages were so convincing that it is apparently a common practical joke played on new delivery drivers by their more experienced colleagues to direct them to that address to make a delivery.
That's mean.
If you're passing that way and see a confused Deliveroo driver, please break it to them gently.
In the 1940s, comedians Eddie Gray and Tommy Trinder played a practical joke in Soho here on Broadwick Street in Soho. Eddie Gray was born in Pimlico. He spoke with a mangled French accent and was known as Monsieur Gray. I think kind of Del Boy from Only Fools and Horses and his kind of very London pronunciation of the wrong French phrase. Tommy Trinder was born in Streatham, so both Londoners. And here, Tommy Trinder made his name as a comedian with a sort of cheeky Londoner sort of persona, often poking fun at the upper classes. So one day, Gray and Trinder are walking down Broadwick Street here. Gray stopped by this post box on Broadwick Street and began shouting into the hole as if he was talking to someone. A crowd gathered and the two comedians explained that a postman had fallen in and he was trapped inside the post box. And if they all stayed here and kept the postman calm, they were going to run away and find a policeman to help. And so Gray and Trinder disappeared around the corner, leaving a crowd shouting into a post box before realising they'd been duped and slinking off. Actually, if we take away the pictures there, a little further up Broadwick Street, if we go a little further ahead on Google Maps, is this public toilet, which was used as the Ad Lav Club in the 1960s comedy sketch show, Not Only But Also. So it's Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, and this was kind of a skit on the private members clubs, basically, the Ad Lav Club. There was a club called the Ad Lib Club, quite nearby. It's where John Lennon was first, he guest starred on Not Only But Also. It's where he was first seen in public with his glasses. Chatting away with Peter Cook there.
Another practical joke was played in the clothes shops in Soho. It said that in the swinging 60s, Keith Moon and one of his friends played a trick in the shops on Carnaby Street. They would go in and ask for the strongest pair of trousers in the shop, and then they would test them by ripping them in two. As the store managers went apoplectic, a one-legged man, secretly another friend of Moon's, of course, would come in and say the ripped trousers were just the thing he was looking for, and ask for them to be wrapped separately.
London's buildings have often come in for a ribbing. Modern architecture opening out to it, but Londoners have given buildings nicknames for years. So in this picture, we've got the walkie-talkie, the cheese grater, and the gherkin. The gherkin does have another nickname, which is very, very rude. This is Eros. Pedants are screaming at the screen now. This is the statue in Piccadilly Circus known as the Angel of Christian Charity. It was nicknamed Eros pretty much on the day it was unveiled in the 1890s. So Londoners have always nicknamed it Eros, always called it Eros. And the old joke about the statue that tour guides still tell today, and by tour guides I mean me, but it was told by Victorian tour guides as well, is that they meant to put the statue the other way around so that it would have buried the shaft of its arrow in Shaftesbury Avenue. Do you see? Big Ben there, again, the pedants are screaming. Big Ben is actually the nickname for the bell within the tower. The real name of the bell is the Great Bell. It's nicknamed Big Ben, and the tower is called the Elizabeth Tower. It was nicknamed Big Ben after either Benjamin Cornt, a boxer, or Benjamin Hall, the director of works. Again, as the old joke goes, it's a good job nobody was called Richard. And here we have Shelmeck's house. So Shelmeck's house was built in the 1930s as the headquarters of Shell, the oil giant Shell, and BP at the time as well. The clock on the roof there is I think it's the widest clock face in Britain. It was made in Croydon in South London. And it was quickly nicknamed by Londoners in the 1930s, Big Benzine. The Shell actually left the building in the late 20th century, 1990s, I think it was. So the joke doesn't really work now, but tour guides still tell it. And again, by tour guides, I mean me.
In 1672, George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, sold his land near Charing Cross Station, with the proviso that a street on the land be named after every part of his name. Villiers was one of the favourites of King James I, which is a coy historian way of saying he was the king's boyfriend. His stipulation probably meant that he wanted a Villiers Street and a Buckingham Street. The new landowner set out a George Street, a Villiers Street, a Duke Street, and a Buckingham Street, and in an hilarious case of malicious compliance, added an off alley, as in Duke of Buckingham. Only Villiers Street and Buckingham Street still have their original names, but the signpost for York Place has the addition formerly of Alley, after Londoners were furious when the comedy name was changed by Westminster Council. There's a few 20th century jokes and jokers that we didn't want to leave out. When Rudyard Kipling read of his own death in a magazine in the 1930s, he wrote to a magazine saying, "I've just read that I am dead. Don't forget to delete me from your list of subscribers." Ronnie Scott was a jazz musician born in the East End. He's perhaps most well known for opening a jazz club in Soho in 1959. He was known for his dry wit when comparing and told the same jokes for years. Apparently, he thought they got funnier the more he told them. Among his repertoire were, "You should have been here last week. Somebody should have been here last week. We had the bouncers chucking them in. Of this place, it has made a happy man very old. Of one of the waitresses, I asked her what she thought of Dickens, and she replied she'd never been to one. When heckled, I see you're drinking on an empty head again, sir, about the food at his club. Ronnie declared it was untouched by human hands. Our chef is a gorilla.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. A customer at Ronnie Scott's club several times in the 1960s was John Lennon, who also made a famous joke at a London theatre. When the Beatles were performing at the Royal Variety Performance at the Prince of Wales Theatre in 1963 in front of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Margaret, among other invited guests, just before performing Twist and Shout, John Lennon asked that those of you in the cheap seats clap your hands, the rest of you just rattle your jewellery. At the following year's Royal Variety Performance, Tommy Cooper was a performer. When introduced to the Queen afterwards, Cooper asked the Queen if she liked football. She replied that she didn't, and Cooper asked if he could have her cup final tickets. Tommy Cooper died on stage at Her Majesty's Theatre in 1984. Fittingly, for a man who dedicated his career to making people laugh, the audience thought it was a part of the show and carried on laughing until the curtain came down abruptly.
So you can make a comedy pilgrimage, of course, to Her Majesty's Theatre. It's just around the corner from Trafalgar Square and Piccadilly Circus. But there's lots of other comedy pilgrimages that you can make in London. Ealing Studios is in West London, most known for the Ealing comedies, of course, such as The Lavender Hill Mob, The Lady Killers, and Passport to Pimlico. If you go to the South Bank, the London Studios, there's the tall black and white building on the South Bank, where they filmed several comedy shows, including Father Ted, On the Buses, and panel shows like QI and Have I Got News for You. On Piccadilly Circus, or just off Piccadilly Circus rather, on Regent Street, St. James, this building used to be the Paris Theatre, which was used by the BBC for live radio, for music, but also for comedy, such as I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue, and the radio versions of Dad's Army, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and The Goon Show. Elsewhere in Westminster, on Strutton Ground, there's a plaque for The Goon Show. Another plaque to a comedy figure here in Neal's Yard. Neal's Yard is just near Covent Garden. Lovely area, very Instagrammable if you're ever around the area. On the building, just to the right there in this picture, is this plaque for Monty Python. Of course, where it was an animation studio editing suite where Terry Gilliam and the others worked. Now, not the only plaque to a fictional character, we've got a plaque to Ziggy Stardust now as well. So, De Hems Pub in Chinatown, just off Shaftesbury Avenue, is where Noel Fielding and Julian Barrett debuted The Mighty Boosh in 1998. Bill Bailey and Dylan Moran work in a little bookshop off Russell Square in Black Books. The exterior was shot in an actual bookshop in Bloomsbury on Lee Street.
In South London, Tooting was home to the urban guerrilla Citizen Smith, founding member of the Tooting Popular Front. And Croydon was a setting for Peep Show, Terry and June, and where Moss and Roy go to bunk off work in the IT crowd. Peckham was home to the Trotters in Only Fool and Horses, although the shots of Nelson Mandela House were filmed in Bristol in the later series, and it's fictional, but there we go. Don't go looking for Oil Drum Lane in Shepherd's Bush, where Steptoe and Son lived, or 34 Claremont Avenue in Kensington and Chelsea, where Edna lived in Ab Fab, because those are both fictional addresses as well. And just in case you haven't heard enough corny jokes today, we'd like to finish with a few London-based jokes. I heard a dog learning to play trumpet on the tube the other day. He went from barking to tooting in about 15 minutes. Laugh when you're ready. The restorers are nearly finished at Big Ben. They've been working around the clock.
Oh.
What do you call London during a power cut? Lundoff. What kind of shellfish can only be found in London? King's crustacean and charing crustacean. Ooh,
Very good.
Very lame.
Well, lame jokes are what we do. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed those jokes and haven't been too offended by the rude jokes or bored by our history stuff. We had a good time anyway.
Yeah.
If you can, please donate to the Multiple Sclerosis Society via the donate page at londonhistory.home.com or just by the MS Society's website. Please like and subscribe on YouTube. Visit us at Facebook and Instagram.
Yeah.
Leave us a virtual tip. No, don't leave us a virtual tip. We'd much rather you donated to the MS Society.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Have a splendid day.